Hello and welcome to a new edition of HYPIA Research, today presented by Matias. I'm going to share my screen and introduce Matias. Before I do that, this is the International Association of Hyperpolyglots, a community of HYPIA scholars, multidisciplinary research on polyglossia with study groups, presentations, etc. And so now we will have the initial presentation on today's topic, which is language and geopolitics. For 15 minutes, please, Matias, summarize the readings and pose questions for the debate. Matias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlitos. Let me share the screen. This is the 16th HYPIA Research meeting. We will talk about languages and geopolitics. As you already know, I'm Matias Barmat. I'm a sports journalist and have a major degree in journalism, and I'm director of recruitment for HYPIA. Language as a geopolitical tool. First of all, let's talk about that. Among the 7,000 languages in existence, only 2.5% of them are spoken by nearly 90% of the world population, around 8,000 million. Within this haze of languages, there are around 20% of people who are English and French speakers, with Mandarin Chinese and Hindi following close behind. Yet, when dealing with international exchanges and diplomacy, it's the language of Shakespeare which has slowly risen to the rank of reference language. A means of uniting countries. If we refer to the population per country, Mandarin and Hindi are well ahead, but it's interesting to note that in terms of number of countries who speak them as first or second language, English, French, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, and Russian are the most common ones. Through the course of history, certain languages have taken on the role of catalyst, benefiting cooperation between countries based on historic relations. Indeed, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the colonization of American, African, and Asian continents played a significant role in the global expansion of Western languages, the so-called languages of control. The historic past has also ultimately fostered the development of international institutions, bringing together countries that are geographically and culturally far apart. In doing so, faced with a unifying linguistic challenge, this cooperation with politics underpin close collaboration between member states on other strategic levels, such as economic, social, and military. A means of asserting identity. Language can be perceived as a challenge of power and can become an object of conflict. When preferring the local language or the local dialect to the national language is not always an innocuous choice and can be supported by a true political conviction. The defense of the local language and culture by nationalistic movements like Catalonia ensure a certain recapturing of their territory, but history has also shown that this is not necessarily the case. It should also be noted that in 1992, with the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages, the Council of Europe encouraged the protection of regional and historical minority language of Europe, some of which risk disappearing with the passing of time, in order to contribute to maintaining and developing cultural traditions and richness in Europe. Therefore, through the promotion of its language, a linguistic power is capable of ensuring influence on an international scale, guaranteeing a certain homogeneity. Conversely, a language can equally be a vector of differentiation and cultural assertion, like Catalan differentiation from Spanish, for example. The linguistic issue, in one sense or another, becomes a true geopolitical instrument that we must take into consideration. Four main reasons. The first of one is the territorial conquest. For example, Latin America by Spain, or half of Africa and India for the British Empire, United States, in the case of English language, or other half of Africa in the case of French, or even Brazil, Angola, Mozambique in the case of Portugal, or Central Asia in the case of Russian, or even though the Arabic half of Africa, or in Middle Eastern, in the Islamic world, or even China in the neighboring territories. Well, in that sense, there's a motivation to take the natural resources of those territories' conquest. Of course, there's a relation of, there's an asymmetrical relation between powers and colonies. And even though the post-colonialism, the modern nation states within Latin America and within Africa, for example, that makes an unbalanced situation between producer and manufacturers, where the trade, commerce, and of course, economical interests derive from that. The religion as a role of spreading the languages in a given era, and the cultural industry. When we talk about cultural industry, we have to take, well, Roger, as you surely know, Roger Silverstone, in his book Television and Daily Life in 1979, point that in one of its chapters about he explained about the relation between TV and consumption. The four facts that interconnected one another, a consequence one another. The first of one, mercantilism. The consumer goods are judged according to the price they acquired in the market, so they take part in an interchange system. Within that interchange system, those goods, those assets, acquire symbolic value according to the buyer and selling countries. There are some values, like, for example, luxury, ostentation, and for example, when acquire an expensive good, like a cell phone, instead of a primary need, a product of primary need, a primary necessity, surely I'm satisfying certain needs of social status. The third question is that the TV, the media, and social networks channel the speech, canalize the speech of what's right or what's wrong in that value scale, and establish that value scale, that priority. The Doll Factory, Hollywood, the series of movies that we usually consume. Well, about the theory of communication accommodation established by Howard Giles, it's a theory that concerns, first, the behavioral changes that people make to attune the communication to their partner, and the extent to which people perceive their partner as appropriately attuning to them. The basis of the theory lies in the idea that people adjust or accommodate their style of speech to one another. Doing this helps the message sender gain approval from the receiver, increases efficiency in communication between both parties, and helps the sender maintain a positive social identity. This theory is concerned with the links between language, context, and identity. It focuses on both the intergroup and interpersonal factors that lead to accommodation, as well as the ways that power, macro and micro context concerns affect communication behaviors. Accommodation is usually considered to be between the message sender and the message receiver, but the communicator also often accommodates to a larger audience, either a group of people that are watching the interaction or society in general. Communication accommodation theories focus on the patterns of convergence and divergence of communication behaviors, particularly as they relate to people's goal for social approval, communication efficiency, and identity. There are two principles, convergence and divergence. Convergence refers to strategies through which individuals adapt to each other's communicative behaviors to reduce these social differences. Meanwhile, divergence refers to the instance in which individuals accentuate the speech and nonverbal differences between themselves and their interlocutors. This is particularly true in the case of Serbsko-Hrvatski, the case of Serbo-Croatian, where Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin standards were coined after the Yugoslav war. Or even between Bulgarian and Macedonian, until 100 years ago, part of the same multi-dialectal language. The creation of Bulgarian standard and Macedonian standard, the creation of different standards becoming different languages for political reasons. And for finishing my presentation, let's talk about, the Girona Manifesto of Linguistic Rights. PEN International, the Association of Poets, Essayists, and Novelists, brings together the writers of the world, developed in Girona in Catalonia, Spain in May 2011 by the PEN International Translation and Linguistic Rights Committee. ratified by the Pan International Assembly of Delegates at the 77th Congress, September 2011. This manifesto declares Pan International's 10 central and guiding principles on linguistic rights. First, linguistic diversity is a world heritage that must be valued and protected. Second, respect for all languages and cultures is fundamental to the process of constructing and maintaining dialogue and peace in the world. Third, all individuals learn to speak in the heart of a community that gives them life, language, culture, and identity. Fourth, different languages and different ways of speaking are not only means of communication, they are also the milieu in which humans grow and cultures are built. Fifth, every linguistic community has the right for its language to be used as an official language in its territory. Sixth, school instruction must contribute to the prestige of the language spoken by the linguistic community of the territory. Seventh, it's desirable for citizens to have a general knowledge of various languages because it favors empathy and intellectual openness and contributes to a deeper knowledge of one's own tongue. Eighth, the translation of texts, especially the great works of various cultures, represents a very important element in the necessary process of greater understanding and respect among human beings. Ninth, the media is a privileged loudspeaker for making linguistic diversity work and for competently and rigorously increasing its prestige. And 10th and last, the right to use and protect one's own language must be recognized by the United Nations as one of the fundamental human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matias. That was great. And now you must stop sharing your screen so I can share mine. And then we can proceed to the debate, okay? So
what are the questions?
Yeah.
The questions.
Yeah, let me just, given that there was no questions, let me just start the second part, which is the debate, right? Let me remind you, please just participate up to 5 minutes maximum to let other people speak. Be respectful, cooperative, and let's make it as clear as possible what we're trying to say, okay? So I have 2 hands raised. I think Tim was first. So we'll go with Tim and then Helga. Tim?
Okay, thank you very much, Matias. I have a comment and also a question. You mentioned in that the language of Shakespeare has become the main sort of lingua franca. I just want to make a point that the English that is spoken among native speakers can very well, I know that Carlos does not like that word, that are spoken in the United Kingdom, for instance, will differ greatly from the English that is used as a lingua franca that is spoken from a second language, a fact that a lot of I think L1 speakers of English are not aware of, in my opinion. The second the question that I have is connected with the idea of convergence and divergence. So one, the article on this, the CAT, the communication accommodation theory, mentioned situations where Castilian speakers would speak Catalan, but they would receive an answer in Castilian, Spanish, and other situations where a non-native speaker of, apologies for using non-native, someone who has learned Japanese as a second language would speak Japanese to a Japanese person, but receive a reply in English. So we have a case where it doesn't. You seem to have a lack of. On the one hand, you have a lack of convergence by the person who's replying because he or she is not replying in the same language. But you could also argue that it is they are assuming that they are converging by speaking a language which they think that the first person, the person who addressed them would like to be addressed and or should want to speak. So could you comment on that?
Okay, so Matias by allusion, and then we'll go with Helga. Matias?
Well, Timothy, explain that in very simple words. It's not the same when we have asymmetry among two very close but different languages, different Romance languages like Spanish and Catalan. It's not the same rather than, for example, when we talk about, for example, Serbo-Croatian and so, or between Serbo-Croatian and Slovene. Or no, sorry, between Serbian and Croatian. Slovene is a different language. When we are talking about that linguistically is the very same language, but for political reasons, they developed different standards with different sources of vocabulary and to emphasis in their grammar, in the very little grammar difference as much as possible, only to create it at different country standards of the same language. In other instance, there's, for example, when we talk about the French instruction in the sub-Saharan Africa, or even though the Russian as a second language matter, as a second language subject in the countries of former Soviet countries except Russia. In those bilingual curricula, even though after their independences, are also up to a certain point a mean of certain asymmetrical control. But even though that control is also motivated by geopolitical reasons. So my opinion about that is that despite languages or the knowledge of languages, even though the language of my enemy, for saying that, enriches me as I can communicate you in another language, despite languages being an added value, I cannot doubt about the role of languages of control that continue to establish a footprint in our daily lives.
Thank you, Matias, for your answer. And now Helga.
So hello everyone, greetings from Sofia, Bulgaria. By the way, so my question would be, Mati, you mentioned Bulgarian and Macedonian and Serbian and Croatian as examples of, in your presentation. Could Romanian and Moldovan also be or like belong to the same category, because Moldovan is like, or is considered to be a dialect of Romanian, or is it also like the same with North and South Korean? Thank you.
It's a very interesting point. In the case of Moldavian, Limba Moldoveneasca, the Moldavian language is essentially is Romanian, or I mean, it's a register of Romanian embedded with a lot of Russian loanwords. And even though up to until 1991, 1992, Moldavian was written in Cyrillic, strictly in Cyrillic alphabet. Right now, both of them are accepted. But Moldavian language, the difference in Moldavian language is literally it's the same Romanian grammar, and even though the 60 or 70% or 80% the same vocabulary. However, due to the amount of Russian and Slavic loanwords or even Turkish loanwords, sometimes it's quite intelligible at dialectal level. But in the same in a sense, Romanian and Moldavian remains the same language. And in the case of what you have mentioned also, North and South Korean, well, the Korean War between 1950 and 1953 forced to different approaches of the Korean languages. In the case of North Korean, and that sense, Judy in the Polyglot conference and Polyglot gathering explained very clearly. Judy now is a fellow HYPIA member. and I knew her personally in Poland, Judy explained how North Korean had a linguistic purism approach, wiping out all the Chinese loanwords, while South Korean has not only a lot of Chinese, a lot of English and French loanwords, a lot of English loanwords, as a westernized form of Korean, literally. And even though among young people there's a lot of slang colloquial words, even though borrowed from English, but literally are in essence the same grammar that North Korean becomes more literally and South Korean more modern, more or less.
Thank you, Matias. Helga, do you have any answer to that, or anybody else wants to contribute?
Yeah, I have like a comment, a little comment, because I know, like I've heard or watched one of the presentations of Judy and now I remember that she mentioned that in North Korean there are many Russian words as well.
Well, due to communist rule and the Soviet, and even though North Korea had a lot of Soviet influence, it's still.
Yeah.
However, I don't know how extent Russian loanwords are present in North Korean. That's why I didn't answer that, because I try to be as objective and scientific as possible.
No, yeah. I know it was only like a fun fact that I remembered. Yeah.
If you guys want to check out my video on why one or two language disputes, such as is Serbian the same as Croatian, etc., cannot legitimately be adjudicated by linguists because they're ultimately political decisions, you can check out that video there. I pasted the link. More comments on either one of the readings or more, or some of the ideas that have surfaced in this debate?
Can I speak to Carlos?
Go ahead, Nawal, and then Ruben.
Yes. Well, you know, I like music very much as well as language learning. And the other day, I just noticed that in the field of music, the notion of convergence is also used. So it's an important concept in the philosophy of language, I think.
In what sense, Nawal?
In the sense that convergence can be regarded as the union of all the musicians performing, for instance.
Okay, thank you, Nawal. Ruben?
Yeah, first of all, so thank you, Matias, also for the great presentation. And I want also to ask you guys, what do you think? Do you think this is an advantage, the richness of the language variations, or this is a disadvantage? So if you think about the richness of the Spanish language, when you think about all around, not only Spanish, but in North Africa and Hispanoamerica, and also in Philippines, or German language. If you see also German speakers in Belgium, in different dialects of German language in Bavaria, in different regions, in Swiss German, in Switzerland, in Austria. I think this is amazing to see the variation of the language influenced by the social culture of the regions, the local cultures, and also which also belongs to a way of personality, character of the region, influence, commerce, as also Matias showing in the presentation. And this is also, I think, an advantage from my point of view for all the speakers to learn how, for example, other people in other region use what you want to say I will say in the same language, but different variation in a different ways. And this is amazing how to say how you call, for example, bus in Canarian Islands, and how you call a bus in Mexico or in another way in Spanish. So I think what do you think about? It's an advantage or it's not disadvantage?
Thank you, Ruben.
Well,
so the question Ruben poses is, whether language variation is an advantage or disadvantage, which he answered in the positive, but then opened the questions to more people. I have Helga who wants to reply, but Usman hasn't participated yet, so we'll go first with Usman and Helga, then answers to Ruben's questions. Okay, Usman?
No worries.
Thank you, Carlos. I want to point out to the opposite trend as well. We have a tendency to look at how, oh, are these different languages really not the same? But actually there's a very interesting tendency, which is in China, where languages or dialects that are entirely unintelligible are put under one umbrella. So because it's one China, we're going to have one Chinese. And so languages that are very unintelligible get dialects that are very unintelligible get put together. When I studied Mandarin for 3 years, it had no suggestive or indicative ability for me to comprehend Hokkien or Cantonese. And so it does work both ways, and that's something for us to think about as well, speaking to what Matias in his excellent presentation talked about the political aspect. Thank you.
Yes, I just want to add very quickly before going back to Helga that the question of whether two languages are language and dialect or different languages supposedly comes down to mutual intelligibility, as Usman commented, and lexical similarity. But in the end, both criteria refer to political issues, hence why it's not, strictly speaking, a linguistic dispute. Helga.
Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity to speak again. So I just wanted to comment what Nawal pointed out. So yeah, I think it's really an advantage because a language or a dialect is more than just like a combination of words or sentences or idioms, whatever. It's also like it's also culture. So you can like or knowing this variety of dialects or like the variations of the same language, so you can learn how like one speaker of this language expresses him or herself in one country and what the differences are and so on. So yeah, I would agree with Nawal and say this is an advantage. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. Usman, do you want to comment by allusion or no? Okay, so then let us answer Ruben's question. Who wanted to answer Ruben's question? Matias? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can answer you very briefly. In the constitution of modern nation states, unfortunately, there were and there will be the need to construct national standards of every given language. However, the reasons why they construct national standards are not only lack of intelligibility, but also several dialects seen as low register of even peasant level language. So in that sense, I think that not only for sake of mutual intelligibility, but also there are political motivations from an elites in the capitals or in the main cities, and also with the same logic extended to an international level, the creation of different lingua francas for mutual understanding makes necessarily the global system as a whole asymmetrically. However, when we talk about how can we defend the linguistic variety or the linguistic diversity, reducing as much as possible the principles of affirmative action or positive discrimination, because for example in the Indian continent there are a lot of minority languages spoken by 1 million people or more, even 100 languages with 1 million people or more. for example, there are more Marathi speakers than, for example, Finnish or Hungarian. I don't know. And so in that sense, how can we defend or promote those minority languages? But unfortunately, there are some educational approaches that encourage even more those breakthroughs about affirmative action or positive discrimination. I mean, there are issues that even though they are linked to a geopolitical at geopolitical level that cannot be resolved from the day to the night.
Thank you, Matias. Anja?
Hello, thank you once again for the opportunity. So I want to open or maybe further develop Ruben's suggestion about advantages of varieties of languages, dialects, or maybe even type of speech. If you remember in the first article, they distinguish between the way that women and men speak. So I don't know if maybe stereotypically or it's true, you can give me your opinion. So they say that women speak more politely, they are more cooperative speakers, they are somehow like work as facilitators or in the conversation. They emphasize solidarity and even reduce inequalities. But on the other hand, they say the men are more eager to hold the floor and maybe control the topics of conversation. I don't know if it's true, if it's very stereotypical, but what are your opinion or suggestions? Thank you.
Yes, Anja, that's why Usman is the director and I'm the moderator. We see the control here. Any other answers? There's, by the way, in the meantime, there is a book I would like to recommend called Language Myths that touches upon this issue. The myth is not so much the difference in the use of language across genders, which does exist and is empirically demonstrated. But the myth is that in our society, at least 10, 20 years ago, there was this idea that women talk too much. And the authors argue, it's not that they talk too much, it's that the people who are in control don't want them to talk as much as they do, which doesn't mean they talk too much, right? That's one language myth discussed in that book. The length might be the same, but the perception about someone talking versus another type of person talking might lead people to conclude that someone is talking more than that the person is actually talking, right? That is the bias. Anja?
Thank you for your answer, firstly, Carlos. And then, yes, maybe I want to further develop this topic about speech. Maybe also, if I remember right, it was again in the first article where they discussed like the situation between maybe patients and doctors and the way the language they use. So more, or they use language, more medical jargon, and how they connect to their patients, in case they start to speak more in the dialect, or if they use less medical expressions. And also, I know in Slovenia, we have a lot of migration from other South Slavic countries who are doctors. Now there is a certain law that they have to have the level of C2, of Slovenian in order to do the job here. But the problem is they still speak their native languages, so some kind of Serbo-Croatian, which of course you understand, but once you are a sick person, it's very hard to communicate. So the question is, should be allowed to speak the language, that the person can understand, or if it's okay once that you only speak in the dialects or in the language of the patient, because he's the one who is sick and should be answered and understood to explain his pains and how he feels understandable. So I don't know, I want to hear your opinions. Thank you.
It's a very interesting issue that a C2 level is required, given that most speakers of a language as their first language don't have a C2 level. So I wonder how many people will pass that. But then again, we're just talking the demographic of workers, right? So they're supposedly highly educated and all of that, which may contribute to a C2.
Yeah, exactly. I honestly, if I may respond about this C2 level, I don't really agree with the C2 level. They're doctors, of course, they can do these exams and they will manage to get the license. What is more important, it's if they are exposed to the language, to have classes of the language so that they can speak and practice the language. Just if you learn for a while, you do the examination, the test, you will reach the level C2 and then you stop using the language. So, and again, when the situation comes, you speak the language you feel more comfortable in. So I think these levels of standards that someone has to get, are too high, and maybe it would be better if they would lower the standards and make the doctors and everyone to speak more, to communicate more, in order to get the vocabulary, to lose this fear of speech, this foreign language that they don't use so often. So thank you for.
Thank you, Anja. More comments on these or related topics? Ines? Go ahead.
It's more like that I want to tell you an example, like connected with Ukrainians that like massively have came to the north or east or to West Europe. For example, there are many Ukrainian doctors in the Czech Republic, but they are not allowed to work because they don't speak Czech, let's say, corresponding to C1 level, and Czechs consider their education not sufficient enough. And Czechs rather, how to say, in the Czech Republic prefer to not. It's actually like the point is that in the Czech Republic they cannot work, but for example in Latvia, which is my home country, Ukrainians are allowed to work. It's enough for them to pass, if I'm not mistaken, A2 or B1 level. And my personal opinion is that for me as a person, the most important is that I get empathical behavior from the doctor who treats me as a human being and is willing to help me. And I don't care if the person is not having C2 level, because C2 level is not a guarantee that you will be a good doctor and you will be kind to everyone. Like, it's my personal opinion.
Yes, thank you, Ines. Yeah, I agree that competence in the language does not equal ability to communicate, right? Which is dependent on extra linguistic factors too, like empathy, kindness, etc. Ruben?
Yeah, I just want to also agree with Ines. The same happens in Germany, where due to there are a lot of missing doctors and sanitary people, nurses in Germany. So mostly when you go to the hospitals, you see people who cannot speak German fluently. So it's normal. So it's okay. It's fine. And I think they're willing to understand. People are really qualified, people who are coming from all over the world, now from Ukrainian, who honestly speaking, they don't speak German, but mostly they speak English or they are learning German. And I think the most important thing is also that they have the willing to help, and they know their job is an issue of the language. And as long as they can communicate each other and understand the problem, so I think there is a communication and the communication is done. So yeah, that was my aportation.
Thank you, Ruben. Any follow-ups to this? We are approaching the 4:50 mark, but before that, we still have to vote on the topic for the next meeting. But we still have a good 10 minutes to discuss these readings. Helga?
Yeah, I have a suggestion for the next topic, but I don't know. I missed it out, so I couldn't hear when we will discuss the next topic. So
Oh yeah, you missed the last one, but you are.
Yeah, I missed the last one, like the last sentence, because my headphones
but you are on
fell
time.
from.
You are on time for the next one, so don't worry about it. We'll do it at the end of this meeting.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah.
Anja?
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe speaking about this relationship between normal people, patients, doctors, between women and men, maybe we can also address the way that people understand the language. So in one of the articles, there was also expressed that each person has its own preferred style, which could be more visual style, auditory, kinesthetic, so that you have to learn and understand the person the way he or she likes to communicate and start the conversation in this way. So if you see the person is visual, you start speaking like it looks like, you know, if it's more auditory, as we hear, or that sounds like, so to somehow mimic the person with whom you speak, and this is the way you connect more to the person, and I don't know, maybe grow better relationships or better basis to the further communication. I don't know, I would like to hear your experience that you had with I don't know, mimicking the person with whom you discussed, or if it was easier to start the conversation after you started mimicking. And I don't know, I would really like to hear your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja. Yes, I've also read that mimicking increases empathy, but I don't have any evidence on this. Does anybody have any previous experience on mimicking people's language to enhance communication? Anja?
Maybe if I answer. I don't know how you start learning languages, but I always I choose one native speaker and start to mimicking and imitating, usually her, because the way women and men speak is different. So as I'm a woman, it's easier for me to imitate a female speaker. So I always choose one person in that native language and try to imitate her, the way she moves, the way she speaks, the way she expresses, the phrases that she uses, and to sound more native-like, and that this is how I gasp and go into the language and learn it easier. I don't know, this mimicking actually for me, it's very helpful to learn the language. I don't know how it is maybe to speak with someone or to send some emails if they answer faster or if they respond, but like to professors or job interviews, I don't know. I would like to hear your experiences.
Thank you, Anja. I have Usman and Timothy. Let's go with Tim, then Usman.
Actually, I have a question to Anja on what you just said. You mentioned that when you mimic someone, you also observe how they look. Now, I by that, do you mean, you know, their gestures, you know, their facial expressions, I think that's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's something that's not talked about so much in language learning, that different people who speak different languages will also move in different ways. And how important do you think your imitation of their movements have been in communicating with them and building a relationship with them?
Can I answer?
Yes, thank you, Tim. Yes, please. Anja, by allusion, and then Usman.
So from my experience, I usually don't choose a real person or a friend, because, you know, if you start imitating someone and repeating everything that he or she says, it will start to, you know, break our relationship. I usually choose one person that that it's maybe an actor or something, a singer that I can hear a lot, that I can, I don't know, follow in different series, different movies. And then when I implement that, what I've learned from this native person, then I implement this knowledge into the real conversation. I don't know if I answered, maybe.
Okay.
Did I answer?
Right. Thank you, Anja, and thank you, Tim. Usman.
Thank you. Yes, it is my experience too that imitation goes a long way, but we always run the risk of becoming caricatures. So for example, when I was learning Spanish for the first time, I was hanging out with Colombians and they would use expressions like, entonces qué, huevón? And then I just did, entonces qué, huevón? And then after a while, they started to find it very uncomfortable. So there's always the risk of caricature, even though you're doing it with the right spirit. And so you have to first build that rapport. Perhaps the best people to mimic, therefore, are people that you are not, as was just mentioned, people who are at a certain distance from you. You know, even my English is mimicry to an extent of public intellectuals that I've been influenced in my life, including an African American. But I don't necessarily sound like an African American when I first strike you, but I have been positively influenced by a public intellectual who spoke in a certain manner. Somebody I recommended to Carlos, in fact, John McWhorter. Thank you.
Yeah, the author of the language hoax, amongst others. Inés, I just noticed that I don't know how to pronounce your first name. Is it Inés or Inés?
In the Latvian way, Inese.
Inés. Okay, Inés, please.
Yeah. So I wanted to say just that I have never done myself mimicking, but I have experienced that somebody tries this like approach with me. All I can say, the first thing I want to say, everything depends on the person. So probably I was too sensitive. But for example, I didn't like when I was being mimicked because to me it seemed like a fake and not genuine behavior. So for me, it's like this, either communication flows or it does not, and that's it.
That's a very good perspective. Is mimicking cultural appropriation? Or is it personal appropriation, identity appropriation, identity caricaturization, as Usman said? Helga?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I have the same experience with imitation as Anya, because I also listen to much music when studying language and try to imitate the pronunciation. What I also do is to use a TTS software, because these voices are also based on professional speakers or actors, so that had or have a really good pronunciation when they recorded their voices for a TTS software. So it's also a really good tool for learning the pronunciation, in order to learn the pronunciation. But I also agree with was it Carlos? No, Usman. Sorry, Usman. Yeah, about caricature. This caricature phenomenon. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic that you raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. Anja?
Maybe to answer or respond to Inés, I pronounce it correctly. I also had a friend from Croatia who said, I don't speak Serbo-Croatian, I understand, but I'm afraid to speak because I haven't found yet the role model whom to follow. In this language or languages, if you start to speak the certain way, you will sound like a Bosnian, you will sound like a Croatian, you will sound like a Serbian. So if I learn a certain way of pronunciation, I'm afraid of being discriminative towards someone else because I speak just, I don't know, certain way. So this is the main reason I wasn't able still to become fluent or speak this language. I mean, I had a friend from Croatia. She said, I have really neutral way of speaking, pronunciation, just speak the way I speak, imitate me. But then, as Inés said, I'm afraid just to, that I will get into her nerves because repeating all the time after her, the way she moves, the way she speaks, every phrase, I think this can't really be practiced with a real person. And maybe for the second, to the Usman, I don't know if it happens to you also, but for me, it depends if I speak with Brazilian Portuguese or Portuguese. I don't know why I switch the pronunciation. So I sound more Brazilian if I speak with Brazilians, and if there's someone, doesn't matter, Portuguese or someone with Portuguese accent, I change and move the way I speak towards more Portuguese like. I know it happens this to you also. I noticed this only with Portuguese. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Anja. It could be an instance of accommodation as described by Matias before. Now I have two hands and we only have 3 minutes left. So let us limit people's turn to just 1 minute, okay? So Inés first and then Usman. Inés.
I just wanted firstly to comment on communication between men and women. Like, I think it's like really like cultural based. For example, if I need to compare, probably in Slavic cultures, like female will be more subordinate, but for example, in the Northern Europe, where men don't speak almost at all, if they are not drunk, the woman is that one who is leading the conversation. So I think it's like cultural base.
Yeah, completely agree with that, Usman.
Thank you. I share Anya's perspective that depending on what type of accent you're dealing with in that language, you may adjust. It happens to me in the rhythm in Spanish, in Portuguese, French, certainly. And I'll tie this back now, all of our conversation about mimicry and all that, to the geopolitics, because I find that deep down, the resentments that come with lumping languages together or putting them apart is the notion that they are mimics of us, them and us. And I also share from that your fear, Anya, that if I speak in a certain way, that people will label me as those type of people. It is a deep set fear that I'm like, oh no, I'm not one of those types, or oh, I'm not one of those, let's say there's a stigma against immigrants, I'm not one of those immigrants, and you feel a certain hesitancy because you may be lumped with the wrong type of people as you go about developing your inner life. So yes, thank you.
Thank you, Matias, for your expression of support. Thank you, Usman, for your brilliant conclusion. Anja has the last turn. Go ahead.
I would just like to ask one question. For example, when I started learning Russian, I started imitating like books. So my Russian sound like, you know, like if you would be reading a book. So I spoke this way. I don't know, it happens to you also that you started then, you know, eliminating the speech of books. So you didn't learn anymore through the listening and through the books, through the fairy tales, but go into the real conversation with the real people to imitate the way that real people speak, not the way that it's spoken, the language in fairy tales, in books, in audiobooks, because, you know, once upon a time, if I would speak English, I'd like to hear your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja. Usman, yes, we have 40 seconds.
Oh, 40 seconds is perfect. I did the same thing when I was first learning Chinese, and I was very literary, and because I used a lot of Chengyu and all of that. But the problem with that is that you only can use that with a certain type of audience who is at least as literate as you are, and oftentimes in real life they aren't. So for example, imagine going to a taxi driver and quoting the Song Dynasty poetry. It's not going to do it for you. It's happened to me and it's very awkward. So you really do have to dumb it down in a certain sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Usman. And with this, we conclude our debates and move on to the next and final part, which is choosing the topic and the presenter for the next meeting. Let me share the screen and we'll jump into the topics, to which we have to add Helga's suggested topic, right? So we have these four plus letter E, which will be, Helga, can you say what the proposed topic is on your account?
Yeah. So can you hear me? Yeah. So it's, I know that
No.
the rule
No,
is like,
now you go ahead, Helga. We couldn't hear you, but now we can.
yeah. So I know that the rule like is to present only one article or something like that, but I don't know if I'm allowed to do an exception and to present a whole book called Discrimination, Combattre la glottophobie, by an author called Blanchet. So this book is in French and talks about glottophobie, linguistic discrimination, and so on in France.
Yeah, is it by Jean Calvet?
What?
Is it by Jean-Louis Calvet, the linguist?
No, it's Blanchet, but the first name I forgot.
In any case, Helga, we need to know the topic first, and then we'll discuss.
Yeah, the topic is glottophobie, linguistic discrimination.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then now we're going to vote. Please, each of you just select one letter of the topic you would like to see presented in our next meeting. And the possibilities are A to D, as you can see on your screen, plus letter E for England, if you want to vote for Helga's topic on glottophobia and linguistic discrimination, okay? So I'm also voting for Helga. So we have Ines, Usman, Timothy, Fabian, So this is a wrap. Yes. So Helga takes this one. She wins, and will be presenting next month on linguistic discrimination and glottophobia.
Thank
Okay.
you. Glottophobia.
So
Yeah, thank you.
thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to moderate this meeting, and I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Good evening.
Thank you.